Good evening, everyone. If I can have your attention, I want to welcome you to the 6th Annual Darrell West Lecture in American Politics. So happy to have you all here on this drizzly day. And we have Ira Shapiro here. And I'm going to talk about Ira for a few minutes, but first I want to talk a little bit about the Darrell West Lecture and how important this has been to the Department of Political Science, the College of Arts and Sciences, and also the Miami University. Darrell West is an alum of the Political Science Department here at Miami, who's made the Darrell West Lecture in American Politics possible. He is certainly a renowned son of the department and of Miami University. After he received his political science degree, he went on to Indiana University to receive his PhD. Then he taught for about 2.5 decades at Brown University, and now he's the Vice President of Governance Studies at the Brookings Institute. And so we're so happy that he's made this possible. He's not here with us today, but he often does attend. He has family in Oxford as well. So he's a very important family for us in political science and at Miami. So for us tonight, we have the pleasure of having Ira Shapiro here. Ira is the president and founder of Global Strategies, LLC, a consulting firm specializing in international trade, U.S.-Japanese relations, and also American politics. Ira received his bachelor's degree from Brandeis University, magna cum laude. He has a master's in politics from UC Berkeley, and then went on to get his law degree at the University of Pennsylvania. Ira has, I guess I will say, a seasoned and renowned career, a long career, practicing international law in private firms for a number of years. He also was general counsel to the U.S. Trade Representative in the Clinton administration. And at that time, he was a critical player in negotiations of passage of NAFTA, as well as negotiations creating the World Trade Organization. He was, Ambassador Shapiro was unanimously confirmed by the U.S. Senate, served as ambassador negotiating important trade issues with Japan and Canada, for example, over auto parts, semiconductors, softwood lumber, a number of important kind of trade issues. Ira also has a deep involvement in presidential campaigns and experience in presidential campaigns, even ran for Congress at one point in time back in Maryland. But we have the pleasure of having him here tonight to talk really about domestic politics and the importance of our domestic politics with respect to Congress and in particular the Senate. And Ambassador Shapiro has very deep roots in the U.S. Senate. He is a Senate guy, as he is described. He served as legal counsel to Senator Gaylord Nelson. Senator Nelson came in during the Kennedy years and had a very renowned career in the Senate, one of the architects of Earth Day, for example. And Ira also served with Bobby Byrd, legal counsel to Bobby Byrd, Democrat from West Virginia. He was also the first chief of staff for Senator Jay Rockefeller. And along with those positions, he served as the staff director for the Senate Government Affairs Committee and also the Committee on Official Conduct. His first book, The Last Great Senate, for those of you that are aficionados of House of Cards, it was in episode 2, I think, sitting on Frank Underwood's desk, the vice president's desk. So that's kind of his book kind of came into kind of common culture in politics at that point. And his second book he's just launching now, titled Broken, Can the Senate Save Itself and the Country? So now I want to welcome, if we can give a warm welcome, Miami welcome for Ambassador Shapiro.
Thank you, Brian. Whenever I hear that kind of description, my conclusion is your speaker is really old. In a career best described as long, I'm very happy to be here today. I have to say that obviously I hope this goes well and is of value to you. For me, just being on campus and having spent time in one of the classes and having dinner with a number of the students has been quite inspiring to me. Wonderful young people. And I started my career a long time ago thinking I was going to be an academic. I went from Brandeis, where I graduated, to Berkeley, where I was going to graduate school in political science. But on the way, I stopped in Washington and had a summer internship with the Senate. And it was the first year of the Nixon presidency, not to date myself. I go back. But I got hooked on the Senate. And at that time, the dominant people in the Senate at the staff level were all lawyers. And it's not so much true anymore, but it encouraged me to go to law school, and I went to law school primarily to come back to work in the Senate. And I did get to work in the Senate again, but I've often thought it was good that I wasn't exposed at a young age to gun running or money laundering or something like that, because I was very impressionable. But the Senate seemed like a place that was worth working in. But I'm happy to be here. My wife, who is a great educator, Associate Vice Chancellor of the Maryland system, says there's nothing greater you can do than try to speak to young people and educate younger people, and not just talk to the same crowd of friends that we have, largely who all agree with us. So I'm delighted to be here. You and your contemporaries hold the future of the country in your hands. You have every right to be angry about the current conditions in the country, and hopefully you'll bring the passion for change, and you'll also bring the capacity for critical thinking, which enables you to understand problems and sort out the truth, which is not that easy in an era of fake news and alternative facts and weaponized social media, where everyone picks their own news sources and their own facts. So we meet at an extraordinary moment. Our country is facing what is at the very least the worst crisis in 50 years, since Vietnam and Watergate. It may be, in my view, the worst crisis in 150 years, since the Civil War tore our country apart. And it could, in fact, be the crisis that the founders of the country, the framers of the Constitution, were worried about 230 years ago. That our democracy would be overtaken by an overreaching and authoritarian president as the guardrails in the political system broke down. We don't yet know which of these crises we were facing. But for the first time, I think it's very realistic to question whether our democratic institutions will hold together. And so for each of us, it becomes important to find ways to do our part to ensure that they do. My book, the reason I'm here is this recent book. My book grows out of this long love of the Senate that goes back a half a century. For me, and for my contemporaries, in the last crisis period, the Senate was a beacon of hope at that time. Enacting the civil rights laws of '64, the civil rights landmark law, the Voting Rights Act, debating and ultimately forcing an end to the Vietnam War, holding Richard Nixon accountable for the dirty tricks and other abuses that we now refer to generically as Watergate. I was fortunate to get a Senate internship with Senator Jacob Javits, the great Republican senator of New York, and it shaped my career. so I spent some time in the Senate, but I left 30 years ago. I had great years there, but since then I've watched, as many people who had the privilege of working in the Senate did, I've watched it decline over a long period of time. In 2008, during the exciting presidential campaign of Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, John McCain, and Sarah Palin, I started writing the first book that became The Last Great Senate. And at the time, I wanted to call attention to what the senators were like, how they made the institution work when it worked at its best. But even as I began to write the book, I was hoping that the election of Barack Obama would change the course of the country, that it would restore our democracy at that time and bring the country together and reverse the Congress's decline. I may have been naive. I certainly was wrong. The exact opposite happened. By the time I completed the book in 2011, the Senate was mired in gridlock. The narrative of my book ended with the first book ended with 1980, but my publisher insisted that I write an epilogue. And so I wrote an epilogue which brought the Senate up to date, and that became the launch pad for this book. The significant thing that I want to say about this book is I started it in the fall of 2016, when I was sure, like everybody else, that Hillary Clinton would be elected president. I was sure she would be elected president, and I didn't think she could govern unless the Senate changed. So I was writing the book for that purpose. Suddenly, Donald Trump won the election. And so the book acquired a different urgency. But the book was not motivated by Donald Trump. It was motivated by something that had been going on longer. So let me give you a succinct summary of the argument of the book. And I think we all know that the crisis in American democracy didn't begin with Donald Trump. I think of our political system as being like the proverbial frog in the boiling water, slowly dying as the temperature went up, over a long period of time, not 2 or 3 years, 2 or 3 decades. And the Senate, in my view, is ground zero for that failure. It's the political institution that has failed the country the longest and the worst. It's been declining for basically 25 years. And why is that? Why do I say that? At its best, the Senate is what Walter Mondale once called the nation's mediator. It was the place where things got worked out, where the diverse interests of our contentious, diverse country came together. The two parties came together. They had supermajority requirements. They had extended debates. They understood that it was their obligation to work things out, to find common ground. It was, as in the words of Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, the Senate was the room where it happened. When the Senate could no longer perform that role, as it succumbed to partisanship instead of overcoming it, the system seized up and became gridlocked. The American people lost confidence in Washington and turned to an outsider, Donald Trump. Trump would not have become president, I think, without being the unique celebrity he was. But he became president because of a justifiable, widespread view that Washington was failing. And who can doubt it? Obviously, I'm painting with a somewhat broad brush here. If we were talking longer, we would talk about the issues that motivated Trump voters, the concerns about immigration, concerns about international trade. But at the moment, we're talking about the performance of the government. And when we're talking about that, the Trump presidency is the result of the polarization, the gridlock, and the dysfunction. But the failure of the Senate is the cause. Moreover, the Senate has reached a new low at precisely the moment that we need it to be at its best, as a check against a potentially authoritarian president. And that's why the title of my talk is The Other Threat to Our Democracy. As if Trump was not enough of a challenge, we have the diminished nature of the Senate. And the failure of the Senate, in my view, and this may be controversial, for the failure of the Senate, I think one person actually bears more disproportionate responsibility. It's no accident, in my view, that the long decline of the Senate, which was gradual, turned sharply downward in the past 10 years. And that downward spiral absolutely coincides with the leadership of Mitch McConnell. Now, I recognize this is a somewhat harsh statement, and perhaps it's not intuitively obvious. Historians always debate the question of whether individuals are accomplishing things or whether larger forces are at work. And surely many factors contribute to the terrible state of American politics today. There is an increasing ideological chasm between the parties. The role of money in politics, particularly since Citizens United. The impact of the 24/7 cable news networks and a five-fold increase in lobbyists. The gerrymandered districts and people choosing their own news sources and eventually their own facts. In America, the past 30 years, our politics have been uniquely undermined by the combination of what has been called the permanent campaign, where there's no time for governing. You never govern, you just get on to the next campaign. And the politics of personal destruction, where some of the best political minds devote their time and talent to poll testing what messages and what votes can destroy their opponents, and designing campaign ads to do that. So there's a lot wrong with our politics. So Senator McConnell's defenders would say he's just a very skilled politician who is adapted to and reflects the nature of today's politics. And one of his closest friends, the late Senator Bob Bennett from Utah, praised him in 2010 for understanding exactly what's happened to the Senate, the changes that have occurred from the days of Bob Dole to McConnell. That argument doesn't really wash for me. I think many people can get away with the argument that they're just simply reflecting the times or victims of the times, or they're just simply taking orders. But I think Senator McConnell has earned a substantial place in our history. 6 terms in the Senate, including 12 years almost as leader now. He doesn't reflect the American political climate anymore. He actually has shaped it at this point. If you look back in political history in the Senate, you find leaders who have made an indelible mark at the time that they're there. Lyndon Johnson, as a Senate leader, has been very famous. He'll always benefit from the great book, Master of the Senate, by Robert Caro. And before Johnson, the Senate had been a fiercely conservative institution. And since Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Senate was the obstacle to the nation's progress, particularly where civil rights was concerned. New York Times reporter and Pulitzer Prize winner William White once looked at the dominated Southern committees in the Senate and pronounced it the only place where the South had not lost the Civil War. The South's unending revenge for Gettysburg. Johnson, although a Southerner, took the Senate. He thought it had to change, and he, with the force of his personality and using every tool at his disposal, he dragged the Senate into the 20th century. But he wore out his welcome quickly in the Senate, and most of the senators were quite happy when he actually became vice president and left them alone. The political historian Lewis Gould wrote, For the Senate, Lyndon Johnson was a noisy summer storm that rattled the window of the upper chamber and left few traces of his passing. He seemed like a towering figure at the time, but his essential lack of vision about the Senate limited his impact. So I used to refer, in my book, I refer to first book, The Last Great Senate. I discovered something that was in plain view but hadn't been noticed. There was a period of time when we had a distinctive Senate, 1960s and the 1970s. And I'm proud of calling it the Great Senate, but over time I changed, and now I call it Mansfield Senate. So Mike Mansfield was a professor of Asian history who was elected to the Senate in 1952. He was a very unlikely majority leader. He was respected for his intellect and his honesty and his knowledge of the world, but he didn't want to be majority leader. When President-elect Kennedy asked him if he would take the job, Mansfield said, "No, I'm not interested in it." But Kennedy persuaded him, and Mansfield went on to be the Senate leader. He made it clear that the Senate was going to be different under his leadership. He believed in a democratic, small d, Senate, where all adults, senators were adults elected by their constituents, and all the senators were equal. And to a degree that stunned the senators, he believed in the golden rule and acted accordingly. He treated each senator the way he expected to be treated, and he demanded reciprocity. He expected reciprocity. And under his leadership, all the senators were involved in the Senate. And many of the senators who were veterans thought the Senate can't work this way. And sure enough, it ground to a halt. By 1963, it was paralyzed. Very little legislation was moving forward. Mansfield was under such criticism that he basically faced a rebellion among the senators. So he prepared a speech to talk about his concept of leadership. It was on November 22nd, 1963, he said that he would deliver that speech the next week. It was never delivered because that day President Kennedy was shot and assassinated in Texas. And so the Senate went on to other things, and Mansfield's speech was never given. It was put in the record. But it opened the door at the time to a new era for the Senate, civil rights legislation, and Mansfield demonstrated his leadership and character early. So you have to envision, Lyndon Johnson, the great Senate leader, is now president, and he's committed to the civil rights legislation. He calls Mansfield into his office, calls him to the White House and says, "I'll tell you how to get this done. The Southerners are old, they're sick. Alan Ellender's got cancer, Richard Russell's an old man. You can wear them down." And Mansfield says, "We're not going to do it that way. We're going to debate this thing, and I will try to overcome their filibuster. And we'll have a national debate, but we're not going to do it your way." And he goes and he tells Russell, the unquestioned leader of the Southerners, how he's going to do it. And they have a fair debate. And ultimately the Senate rises to the occasion, invokes cloture, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 becomes law. And Mansfield and the Senate go on for the next 16 years to have the strongest period of time. It's no longer a graveyard of progressive dreams. It's a place where the most productive legislative period of all takes place. He created a Senate based on trust and mutual respect and bipartisanship. Bipartisanship, when we were there at that later time, it was second nature in the institution. Nothing could be accomplished without it. The senators could battle over important issues, and then after an extended debate, they would strike compromises and they'd go out to dinner together. There was a healthy balance between the leaders on the one hand and the committees and the individual senators. Filibusters were rare, limited to very serious issues. Holds were short-term, a courtesy you extended to somebody coming in from the airport or out of town. But Mansfield's legacy and the reason I say this goes beyond the trust, mutual respect, and bipartisanship. He explained what the Senate should be. He said in his speech in '63, the constitutional authority doesn't lie with the leadership. It lies with all of us, individually, collectively, and equally. In the end, it's not the senators as individuals who are of fundamental importance. It's the institution of the Senate. It's the Senate itself that is one of the foundations of the Constitution. It's a rock of the Republic. And so the senators shared Mansfield's core belief about whatever their agendas were. The Senate was what mattered, and the need to take collective action is what mattered. So Mansfield led the Senate for a long time, and then Howard Baker and Robert Byrd took over, and the Senate continued to work the same way. In constitutional crises which tested the Senate, Mansfield, Byrd, Baker, they all stepped up and played leadership roles. We still remember Howard Baker for the famous question, what did the president know and when did he know it? They all played the roles they should in checking Richard Nixon during Watergate. They were great Senate leaders during crisis, but they were great senators all the time. That's how they functioned. So, Howard Baker, I will just say one story about Baker of Tennessee. You have to envision him. He's the new minority leader in 1977. Jimmy Carter is the president, just new president, outsider president. Carter decides he wants to have a new treaty governing access to the Panama Canal. All the other presidents, the last 5, have ducked the issue. Howard Baker's reaction is, says to his staff, why now? Why me? And the staff says to him, if you do this, Senator, you support this, you'll never be president. The Republicans will never nominate you. And Baker says, I understand politics of it, but I'm the Senate leader, and so I'm going to do what's right for the country. And Baker does.